for about it, because by like protocol, he'll recognize Mrs. Watson Coleman. But if she wants him to go first, we can tell Mr. Kakko that.
I'll ask him.
Okay, just let me know. Oh, here's Mr. Estes.
I'm good.
It's very nice. And then were they the ones that were sent to me later? That's like,
No,
okay.
these
These are different?
are in here.
Okay.
We had some issues with our technology this morning, but we updated. This is your openings. These are your questions. So we
Yeah.
included in here an officer misconduct question related to the
Yeah.
court. And
Yeah.
then earlier in the questions, we added a GAO question off to TSA resources. The other thing that we did from our conversation yesterday is we updated your opening statement to include the travel.
Mm-hmm.
And that's only difference.
Okay.
Related to the travel ban now, this was the background information we talked about getting you. This is what was sent to our folks. Take a look at that whenever you get a second. So he's here. Also, Mr. Johnson is coming. During the opening statement portion, do you want him to?
Sure. What do I call it? Morning? Yeah. So she had my calls turned off.
Don't worry about it. Just let it like a raw line.
We did the same thing. Okay, I'll let him know.
Okay.
All right, guys, how are you?
Good morning.
How's everything? Good to see you.
How are you?
Sorry, go ahead. Okay.
So if he comes before you recognize Mrs. Watson Coleman, she'd like him to be recognized first.
Oh, Benny? Of course, yeah.
Recognize
Yeah,
Mrs. Watson Coleman and then recognize.
I know the big dog.
Yep,
Yeah,
that's
I
right.
understand. This courthouse can be fun.
Good.
It's gonna be really cool. Are you bringing your hubby?
Yep.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Bring my wife too, that'd be good. It's gonna be really nice. Thank
You
you.
have some individual issues because I told me this.
You do? But we'll just tell the Marines and we'll make sure that they accommodate you. You know?
Yeah.
I got, you should see my right. They took 50 cc's of fluid off it last week.
And they had a little lady in that.
Really?
Yeah.
You need to get it scoped.
I had it years ago. It never came back to me. They told me because of that I had arthritis, but
Yeah.
the original. Now I have two new tears.
I was
The
thinking
knee
replacement.
replacement of anything.
How much it gonna do for me? A little bone. Fever, I think you're stuff.
Eh?
Kind of fill up your cracks and that's gone.
Yeah.
And then you got pain. We're trying to stave off good stuff that can come into it.
You guys need to do it?
Back home probably. How about you?
I'm looking back home
Yeah.
because I've been going to University of Washington, going down here. I want in Michigan.
The Committee on Homeland Security, Subcommittee on Transportation and Protective Security will come to order. The subcommittee is meeting today to examine global aviation security standards at last point of departure airports and assess the Department of Homeland Security's current security capabilities in order to protect American aviation assets and American citizens traveling internationally. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. The recent failed plot to take down a passenger plane in Australia is yet another stark reminder that aviation still stands as a top target for terrorists around the world. This is the last in a series of incidents, unfortunately, some of which have been successful from the terrorist standpoint. This incident is alarming for many reasons, but perhaps most disturbing is how the improvised explosive device came into the hands of the suspect. According to reports, an ISIS operative sent the parts of the IED on a cargo plane from Turkey to the suspects in Australia. The suspects were able to build the IED and then attempt to conceal it in their luggage. Fortunately, the bag was over the weight limit and unable to be brought on the plane. If not for good luck and stupidity on the part of the bad guys, this plot could have been successful. The Australians called this one of the most sophisticated plots that has ever been attempted on Australian soil. Exposing not only the vulnerabilities and threats to both passenger and cargo aircraft, this plot illuminates the importance of the international community in securing aviation. The international aviation system represents our modern, globalized world. However, with interconnected transportation systems come interconnected risks. No matter how good our domestic airport and aircraft security is, we must continue to raise the standard of global aviation security for foreign countries and last point of departure airports. It is imperative that aviation security standards are robust and that these standards are commonplace in foreign countries, especially those with last point of departure airports to the United States. Confidence in aviation security at home begins with the assurance that our global partners are enforcing security standards abroad. Today, the subcommittee holds this hearing to better understand the scope and impact of Homeland Security's global programs aimed at securing international aviation, as well as recent efforts to enhance security at overseas airports with direct flights to the United States. We want to hear from all of our witnesses about what we are currently doing to improve global aviation security, as well as what we could be doing better and how Congress can work with the department to support those efforts. And I must say, I encourage you all to speak frankly and candidly and not just have talking points and not just have glossy overarching language. You want to get down to nitty gritty. You want to know how we can do better and what the actual vulnerabilities are. And we can't afford to ignore the potential security lessons from the Australian incident, which was thankfully unsuccessful. Just as the failed 2010 Yemen plot led to major improvements to cargo screening, we must use this as a way to assess and improve our own security and the security of our international partners. Additionally, ISIS's role in this plot solidifies their sophistication, unfortunately, and their determination and ability to threaten every corner of the globe, despite losing large parts of its so-called caliphate in Iraq and Syria. Homeland Security's overseas mission is now more important than ever, and it is critical that this subcommittee understands the extent of the department's global reach, as well as how the U.S. government is working with foreign partners and aviation stakeholders to enhance security at overseas airports. The subcommittee supports the recent security measures that were implemented for inbound flights to the U.S. We look forward to hearing how these measures are improving our security and what else is under consideration to continue to raise the standard of global aviation security. Additionally, we want to hear about the efforts of other entities, such as the International Civil Aviation Organization, in setting aviation security standards worldwide. ICAO, as it's known for short, and other entities are an essential component in proliferating security best practices and capacity building at high-risk airports around the world. However, the sad reality is that many airports around the globe with inadequate security are receiving passing grades based on ICAO standards that I believe are outdated. Homeland Security must do all it can to raise these international standards and ensure their enforcement, and I look forward to hearing more about that. Throughout the 114th and 115th Congresses, this subcommittee has worked to close security gaps at last point of departure airports. This includes my legislation signed into law that directs TSA to perform comprehensive security risk assessments of all LPD airports and develop a strategy to enhance security for inbound flights, while also authorizing TSA to donate screening equipment to foreign airports in need of advanced technology. It also includes Chairman McCall's Homeland Security Authorization Bill, which directs the U.S. to work with international partners to increase the minimum standards for aviation security worldwide. and requires foreign airports to provide U.S. inspectors with information about the screening and vetting of airport workers during regular security assessments. These pieces of legislation highlight the challenges of our foreign partners, highlight the challenges our foreign partners face in passenger and cargo screening, as well as vetting aviation workers with access to secure and sensitive areas of airports. These efforts in Congress, together with the actions of Homeland Security abroad, will continue to bring attention to last point of departure airport security and show the global aviation community that the U.S. is serious about these international challenges. Regardless of how challenging they may be, however, we must always strive to lead in this critically important area, because raising the aviation security standard around the globe will ultimately keep America safe. And we all know, we all acknowledge that America is the holy grail for terrorism, and we must understand that by keeping standards that are in place in America and trying getting those standards internationally is critically important. Now, I'm pleased to recognize the ranking member and my friend of the subcommittee, the gentle lady from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman, for her opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Katko, and thank you for convening this hearing. I appreciate the witnesses being here today as well. This year, there have been a series of thwarted terrorist plots that underscore the diverse nature of the threat to aviation. We know that when the Department of Homeland Security issues an aviation security directive, the entire world reacts. It is important that this subcommittee continues its robust oversight of DHS's efforts to raise baseline security at overseas airports. Over the past decade, TSA and CBP have played central roles in these efforts. The Obama administration expanded CBP's pre-clearance program to help the Department of Homeland Security identify terrorists, criminals, and other security threats prior to boarding passenger planes. Additionally, under President Obama's leadership, DHS pushed out policies that improve security for U.S.-bound flights, principally through active engagement with the international body that oversees standards for civil aviation. It is imperative that Congress and the Department of Homeland Security build on the gains made under the Obama administration to advance aviation security. The recent aviation threats posed by large personal electronic devices and the foiled Australian airplane attack demonstrate that we cannot place 9/11, subsequent attacks, and thwarted plots in the rearview mirror. We must continue to move forward. In moving forward, Congress has a responsibility to prioritize agency spending. My colleagues on the other side of the aisle should familiarize themselves with the phrase opportunity costs. For every dollar that is diverted to erecting the politically motivated border wall, there are fewer resources for doing vital, real security work like international engagement on aviation security or surface transportation security, an area of which I am particularly interested. As stewards of the taxpayer dollars, we have a duty to put valuable taxpayer resources in the areas of greatest need. Providing adequate resources is paramount to allowing TSA to quickly respond to threats. I hope to hear more today about where the agency's needs are, as well as how they have adjusted to the recent threats. I look forward to hearing from CBP about their pre-clearance program and plans for the future. The Obama administration planned to expand that program by 10 new foreign airports, but it is unclear whether President Trump has a desire in growing this security program. I will be happy to hear what you have to say about that. I am pleased to see GAO participating in today's hearing. GAO has been a steady source for Congress as we learn more about security for last points of departure airports. Their contribution to today's hearing is invaluable. I look forward to engaging with GAO about their findings and issues for Congress to consider. Finally, let me say that the new Trump travel ban is deeply troubling. Indefinitely banning all citizens of certain countries from applying for visas to the United States is not only bad security policy, it is un-American. I am confident our government can continue to conduct individualized risk-based assessments on visa applicants that ensure our nation's security without undermining our fundamental principles as a nation. I hope that the courts will closely scrutinize this most recent travel ban. Urge my colleagues to exercise our oversight authority on this issue. With all that said, once again, I thank the witnesses for appearing before us today. Look forward to hearing from you today on those critically important issues. And as a side, let me just say that having read your written testimonies that you submitted, I am very impressed with the measure of accountability, checks and balances that are employed with in the work that you do, and I feel a certain sense of confidence having read that. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watson-Coleman. Other members of the subcommittee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. We are pleased to have a distinguished panel here to testify before us today on this very important topic. Let me remind the witnesses that their entire written statements will appear in the record. Our first witness is Mr. Craig Lyons. Mr. Lyons served as a director of compliance for the Office of Global Strategies at the Transportation Security Administration. That's his current role. And prior to that role, Mr. Lyons served as the Director of Global Affairs, International Operations from 2014 to 2017, where he was responsible for reducing security risks to global transportation modes through operational support to TSA representatives, or TSARs. Previously, Mr. Lyons was stationed overseas as the attaché for the United Kingdom, Ireland, and Iceland, based at the U.S. Embassy in London, which is pretty cool, I must say. I have a lot of family over in Ireland still. I now recognize Mr. Lyons for his opening statement.
Thank you. Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Watson-Coleman, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify regarding TSA's Global Aviation Security Mission. My name is Craig Lyons, and I serve as TSA's Director of Global Compliance. The terrorist attacks of TWA Flight 847 and the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 were two significant events from which the Foreign Airport Assessment Program was founded and that led me to seek a career in international aviation security. I began my federal career as a civil aviation security inspector for the FAA, have held a number of international positions at TSA, including as an international industry representative, the TSA representative attaché to the United Kingdom, and most recently in executive leadership positions within TSA's international program. It was during my overseas posting in London that I had the opportunity to serve as the U.S. Speaker at the 25th anniversary of the Pan Am Flight 103 attack in Lockerbie, Scotland, pledging at the somber anniversary our unrelenting commitment to continuing the fight against terrorism, protecting global civil aviation, and seeking to ensure that these types of horrific events never occur again. Yet as terrorists actively pursue multiple approaches to compromising the global web of civil aviation, targeting both passenger and cargo aircraft, including innovative methods for concealing explosives, recruiting airport and airline insiders, attacking airport public areas, and hijacking aircraft, TSA has taken significant steps to address not only these threats, but to raise the global baseline for aviation security. TSA has worked closely with airlines and industry on enhanced security measures enacted in June 2017. These measures help to secure flights from more than 280 last points of departure airports in 105 countries around the world. These enhanced security measures, both seen and unseen, will improve screening and heighten security standards for airlines and airports. The Global Compliance Directorate is responsible for ensuring the effective implementation of these measures through the worldwide deployment of our assessment teams. TSA's international inspectors are located in 6 regional offices throughout the world. As required by law, TSA is responsible for assessing foreign airports with direct flights to the U.S. and inspecting aircraft operators with service to the U.S. During fiscal year 2016, TSA conducted 135 foreign airport assessments and 1,880 air carrier inspections. The United Nations' recent passing of Security Council Resolution 2309 called upon the international community to bolster its efforts to secure international air travel. Within ICAO, TSA continues its work to enhance international aviation standards. Recently, TSA Administrator Pakowski spoke at the ICAO Symposium, where he emphasized the importance of advancing global aviation security. These include fostering a culture of security, information sharing, ensuring rigorous implementation of standards, adopting innovation and technology, all with thorough oversight programs. To assist and promulgate the efforts of raising the baseline, TSA has forward-deployed TSA representatives who serve as the on-site attachés at embassies abroad. TSARs are charged with building and maintaining strong security partnerships around the world to advance TSA security policies and initiatives. Additionally, TSA international industry representatives serve as the primary liaison to over 330 foreign and domestic airlines. They coordinate information sharing on aviation security requirements, security policy, and incident management. TSA Federal Air Marshals also cover numerous flights departing from international airports. Our mission overseas is to identify, analyze, and mitigate vulnerabilities to reduce the risks to inbound aviation. Our assessment and inspection information allows us to identify vulnerabilities and develop mitigation plans to address them. Capacity development is one of our primary methods for addressing vulnerabilities. Activities range from traditional classroom training, interactive workshops, technical assistance, mentoring, and equipment loans and donations. In fiscal year 2016, TSA conducted 47 capacity development events worldwide. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss TSA's role in international aviation security. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Lyons. Every time I hear someone mention Pan Am 103, I think one of my best friends for the last 20 years who lost his sister on that flight from Oswego State. And I also think of the 35 students from Syracuse University who died on that flight, and they were in my district. And there's a big monument up on the university where I went to law school commemorating that terrible day. And it's what drives me and drives all of us, I think, to make sure something like that never happens again. But we must face the reality that that is always a possibility, and that's always a goal of the bad guys. So we have to be ever vigilant in what we do here on our committee to make sure that we're doing everything we can to hold people's feet to the fire in the international community. We appreciate you being here today, and we thank you for your testimony, Mr. Lyons. Our second witness is Mr. Todd Owen. Mr. Owen became the Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Field Operations in February and currently oversees over 29,000 employees, including more than 24,000 CBP officers and CBP agricultural specialists. Previously, Mr. Owen served as the Director of Field Operations for Los Angeles Field Office, where he had responsibility and oversight for all CBP operations in the greater Los Angeles area. And prior to arriving in Los Angeles, Mr. Owen served as Executive Director of Cargo and Conveyance Security in Washington, D.C., and as a Director of the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, also known as, I can't even pronounce it, CTPAT. The Chair now recognizes Mr. Owen for his opening statement, and I must admit that's one of the more interesting acronyms I've seen in Washington. So, welcome. And before you start, Mr. Thompson's here. He's a ranking minority member on the Homeland Security Committee. And when we get done with your testimony, if you'd like, Mr. Thompson, you'd be happy to allow you to have a statement, make a statement. Okay, please go ahead, Mr. Owen.
Okay. Good morning, Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Watson Coleman, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today to discuss U.S. Customs and Border Protection's role in cargo and passenger security as it pertains to the international aviation sector. As the Unified Border Security Agency of the United States, CBP is charged with securing our borders and preventing the introduction of terrorists and terrorist weapons into our country. In response to 9/11 and the persisting threats from terrorists who have long viewed aviation as the leading target for attack, CBP continues to adapt our multi-layered security approach and strengthen our ability to detect risk and mitigate diverse aviation threats, those posed by passengers, cargo, commercial conveyances arriving at our ports of entry. This multi-layered approach is integrated into every aspect of our rigorous travel and cargo security operations at every stage along the international trade and travel continuums. Each day, over 1 million international travelers cross our borders, approximately 300,000 in the air environment. Additionally, over 1 million international air cargo packages enter our country every day. As an international travel continues to grow, and with the increase in e-commerce, these volumes are sure to climb. In the travel environment, CBP leverages advanced data, enhanced targeting systems, multiple pre-departure safeguards, international programs, and partnerships, all part of our strategy to secure air travel by pushing our borders outward through the early identification of and response to potential threats. CBP's travel security approach starts well before the traveler boards a plane. Before traveling to the United States, most foreign nationals must obtain a non-immigrant or immigrant visa issued by the U.S. Embassy or Consulate, or if they're eligible for travel under the Visa Waiver Program, they must apply and be approved for travel authorization through the Electronic System for Travel Authorization, or ESTA. From the moment they apply for a visa or complete their ESTA, CBP's National Targeting Center begins to assess the risk of the applicant against law enforcement, intelligence, and national security databases. This vetting performed by CBP is continuous and occurs through arrival into the United States ports of entry. Then, once travel is booked and before the flight departs, CBP then uses airline reservation data, airline passenger manifests, previous border inspection information, intelligence, and law enforcement information to identify travelers of national security concern who are likely inadmissible into the United States. CBP is then able to address potential concerns through a suite of international enforcement and liaison programs, such as pre-clearance, the Immigration Advisory Program, the Joint Security Program, and through our regional carrier liaison groups. These partnerships provide CBP the ability to address identified risk or prevent the boarding of individuals who pose a threat to the country or are inadmissible into the United States. It is important to note that upon arrival into the United States, all persons, regardless of citizenship, are subject to inspection by CBP officers. CBP officers review entry documents, collect biometrics, query CBP and other law enforcement databases, and interview each traveler before deciding if the traveler is admissible into the United States. Likewise, in the air cargo environment, CBP leverages advanced information about the cargo, conveyances, and persons involved in a shipment to identify those shipments which may potentially pose a risk to homeland and aviation security. As part of our Air Cargo Advanced Screening Pilot Program, or ACAS, CBP receives advanced information on shipments prior to loading onto the aircraft bound for the United States. Air cargo shipments warranting additional scrutiny may be examined at the last point of departure through coordination with our TSA and international partners. The ACAS program was launched by CBP and TSA in October of 2010 in response to the foiled Yemen printer cartridge bomb plot. To date, the ACAS pilot program has 53 voluntary participants from the air cargo community and covers 83% of the air cargo shipments headed to the United States. Lessons learned from the program have allowed CBP to effectively target, identify, and mitigate risk in the air cargo environment while minimizing impact on trade operations. In conclusion, CBP will continue to work with our federal and international partners, as well as commercial carriers in the trade community, to strengthen our ongoing efforts to secure the aviation sector against terrorists and other threats and promote safe and efficient international travel and trade to the United States. Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Watson-Coleman, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Owen. We appreciate you taking the time to be here today and provide your testimony. Our third witness is well known to us. That's Ms. Jennifer Grover. Ms. Grover is a Director of Government Accountability Office's Homeland Security and Justice team, leading a portfolio of work on transportation security. In this position, she oversees GAO's reviews of the TSA and Coast Guard programs and operations. She joined GAO in 1991 and regularly testifies before congressional committees as an expert witness. She earned a master's degree in public policy administration from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and a bachelor's degree in political science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. I now recognize Ms. Grover for her opening statement.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairman Katko, Ranking Member Thompson, Ranking Member Watson-Coleman, other members of the subcommittee, and the staff. Thanks for the opportunity to testify today on last point of departure airports. My main message is that TSA has a strong program in place to assess security and address deficiencies at foreign airports, but could improve its data management to better understand the effectiveness of different approaches that they use to enhance foreign airport security, as well as the overall state of LPD security. Through its assessments, TSA evaluates the security measures that are in place at the roughly 300 airports across the world that fly directly to the U.S. Over the past years, TSA has significantly improved its foreign airport assessment program by adding more consistent and targeted assessments, risk-based operations, more systematic vulnerability scores, and new approaches for data analysis. When TSA inspectors do identify a deficiency, they have a broad set of tools that they can use to help foreign officials address the problem, including on-the-spot counseling, training for airport staff, technical consult, and providing equipment. Importantly, TSA can also require the air carriers operating from that airport to implement security procedures to help fill any gaps in airport security measures. Figuring out how to best address a deficiency is complicated because each airport is unique in its laws, customs, the equipment, and the knowledge about how best to use it. So what works at one airport may not always work well at another airport that has the same type of problem. Therefore, TSA needs good data on the root causes behind each deficiency, what corrective actions were recommended, what capacity building steps were taken, and the outcome, to understand how to most effectively deploy its resources. We found that TSA does have a data management system to track these factors, but agency officials are not using it consistently and the data fields are not specific enough. For example, a review of the 2016 data showed that 70% of the data on root causes and corrective actions was blank. If TSA officials were to complete the database as required, and if the data collected was more specific, the agency could analyze the relative success of different types of approaches and would also have better visibility on the state of security at LPD airports worldwide. In our forthcoming report, we will recommend that TSA make these changes. One note of caution before I conclude. Although TSA has a strong program for assessing foreign airports, that does not necessarily ensure strong security across all LPD airports. Some airports still struggle to fully implement all aspects of the ICAO standards. Our analysis of 5 years' worth of TSA data from 2012 to 2016 showed regional variation in LPD airport compliance with the ICAO standards. TSA considers the results to be sensitive, so I can't address them here. But I can say that airports in certain regions are more likely to fall short of the standards, and that some of the ICAO standards tend to be more challenging to implement than others. Given the ongoing vulnerabilities that remain at some LPD airports, TSA should pursue improved data management to better monitor the relative effectiveness of the wide variety of different approaches that they have available to them, as well as the aviation security environment as a whole. This concludes my statement. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Grover. And before I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions, I want to recognize my friend from Mississippi, the ranking minority member, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes of opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I'm interested in getting to the questions, and I'll just submit my written testimony for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questions. Ms. Grover, I want to start with you. A couple of quick questions I have for you. You mentioned, well, one really. You mentioned they can improve data management, but something you said later in your testimony really kind of concerned me, and that was that some airports struggle to comply with ICAO standards. And as you know, and the whole panel knows, ICAO standards are the bare minimum by which airports must operate. And if LPD airports are not complying or struggling to comply with even the bare minimum standards of international travel, that's quite concerning to me, to say the least. So I know we can't get into which airports and which standards they're struggling to comply with in an open setting, but I definitely want to be able to follow up with you in a secure setting, either through a briefing or through written statements for the committee to have. But I want to take a step back for a second about the ICAO standards overall. Based on your years of experience and what you've seen, do you have concerns about some of the requirements of ICAO standards not being sufficient, number one? And number two, do you have any concerns about any suggestions about how we can make those standards better? And one of the things I'm concerned about is what you said. And if we have these standards and people are struggling to meet them, why are they still having LPD airports flying into the United States?
Yes, sir. I appreciate the question. So the ICAO standards are very broad, and they encompass essentially all aspects of airport operations. So in that aspect, they're quite comprehensive. And I agree, they do provide a baseline set of standards, and they are non-prescriptive. So there are lots of different ways that airports across the world, in theory, could meet the standards. And so this really gets at the heart of what we're talking about today, is the TSA inspectors, when they're out doing their assessment every single time, they have to make a judgment about what they see in place at that airport to say, is the situation adequate to ensure security? And what they do is, at the end of each assessment, they essentially rate the airport on a 1 to 5 scale, depending on their assessment of the vulnerabilities. So is everything in good shape, or are there vulnerabilities that are coming to the fore?
Now, is that assessment, the 1 to 5 scale, is that based on the ICAO standards, or is it just based on other standards as well?
It's based on the ICAO standards. It's based on the inspector's assessment of how well the airport's doing at implementing the ICAO standards. And they have several tools that they can use that TSA has developed over time to make sure that those judgments are consistent and that they look at everything that's important. So, TSA also has several tools they can use to work with airports, and the air carriers are really the fallback measure. So it is important to note that even if there's vulnerabilities at an airport, that doesn't necessarily mean the flight departing that airport is not secure, because the air carriers can fill in as a backstop.
Okay, that still is troubling to me, because of course airlines want to make sure their flights are safe. There's a business aspect, a business incentive that's quite strong to make sure they do that. But still, I'm not quite sure I understand the depth or gravity of the situation with respect to airports that are not being able to keep up with the ICAO standards. So we'll have to talk about that in a secure setting. But more importantly, do you think it's time for more prescriptive measures for ICAO, given the repeated attempts, and some successful, some not successful, on airports, especially in the Middle East? I mean, look what we've had. We've had the Diallo Airlines, the Metrojet, and we have Egypt Air, and we had the attempt in Australia. That's all within the last 2 years. And so I'm interested in that.
So I would defer to DHS on that. At the end of the day, it is the responsibility of the DHS secretary to determine whether or not the measures in place at any airport are sufficient. And the secretary always have the option of saying that flights cannot come to the U.S. from a specific airport. And as far as strengthening the ICAO standards, I mean, I do think it would be valuable to follow up with TSA. They have all of the data on the specific vulnerability scores and the risk assessments, so they have a good understanding of the vulnerabilities across the world, as well as the threats. But given that there are airports that are currently not meeting the ICAO standards regularly, that are in place now, I'm not sure that raising them across the board would necessarily help lift up those airports. TSA has a number of tools that they're using to try to work with airports to enhance their efforts to meet the current ICAO standards.
I understand it, but for example, the laptop ban seemed to snap some of those airports into order, and I really applaud Homeland Security and TSA for having the guts to do that, because it worked. It sounds like they got their act together. But I don't think we should be in a situation, and we'll ask the others as well, of just simply saying, well, they can't meet the ICAO standards as they are now, so there's no sense of raising them. That's not what we should do. We don't want another Pan Am Flight 103. We don't want another attempt like the Australian Airlines. And Lord knows, based on the secure briefings we've all had, that the vulnerabilities are getting more and more difficult to detect. So I think we need to have a more robust discussion in a secure setting on that. But Mr. Roman, I'd like to hear from you about my question about ICAO standards. Whether you think that they're sufficient, whether they need to be tweaked, whether they need to be revamped.
Well, really, with the ICAO standards, that really is under the purview of TSA. Where CBP comes involved is at those last point of departure airports where we have a physical presence, i.e. the pre-clearance locations. We do have 15 pre-clearance locations around the world, and as part of that agreement with pre-clearance, those airports adopt higher security standards, not only on the screening side as administered by TSA, but as well as things such as vetting the airport employees who have access to the federal inspection site to the aircraft. At those 15 pre-departure airports, individuals with access, we have their biographic and biometric information, which we run through all of our targeting screening. So in many ways, I see pre-clearance as the gold standard in our counterterrorism efforts overseas at last points of departure. Again, we're at 15 locations. Ranking Member, we are expanding. We have 2 new agreements in place, and we're negotiating with another 10 countries. So we will continue to advance that program under the last administration as well as under the current administration.
So what can we do? And I agree with Ms. Watson-Coleman as well. I think preclearance is critically important. So what can we do in Congress to help you expand that program and incentivize all those countries to get on board? Because that may be a way to basically say, if you're not, I'm sorry, the LPD, if you're not on board, you're not doing your job. We can't take the risk.
Yeah,
So what can we do
absolutely.
to help you with that?
Absolutely. With the preclearance, again, the countries come to us in a voluntary nature. So anything we can do to encourage additional countries to want to partner with us through the preclearance model is definitely the step forward. We need to make sure in each of the preclearance agreements that we do sign that our officers have the full authorities to conduct the performance of their duties as they would in a U.S. airport. So we cannot have reduced standards for our officers overseas. They must have the same standards as we do here in the United States.
All right, that's excellent. Mr. Lyons, is there anything you want to add before I turn it over to Ms. Watson-Coleman and Mr. Thompson?
Yes, thank you. As you know, the ICAO standards are outcome-focused, and as Ms. Grover pointed out, our TSA assessment and inspection teams, they're looking at actually at the implementation effectiveness of those standards. For example, controlling, one of the standards would be all contracting states shall ensure and control access to a critical restricted area of an airport. Our inspection teams are looking at how well that's being performed. We do that by first reviewing the national programs, what is set out by the state, and then that's at the macro level. Then we will get back into the looking at the airport implementation, how well that airport is meeting those standards. They could be such as having a fence with 3 strands of barbed wire. If we find a hole in the fence, we're looking at, okay, what are they doing beyond that to control that, whether they have guards, patrols. So we're ensuring how well they are actually meeting that national standard during our assessments and inspections.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes the ranking member, Mr. Thompson, for 5 minutes of questions. I will note, Mr. Thompson, that I went over a little bit, and the chair will exercise a lot of flexibility since we don't have a lot of members here today.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Ms. Grover, you talked a little bit about the lack of the analyzing data. Can you expound a little bit on that?
Yes, sir. So at the micro level, TSA has good information about what's going on at each airport. And one of the things that TSA has done really well in the past few years is developed regional data analysis groups. So they have their staff get together and they talk all about what are the threats and vulnerabilities for a specific set of groups in a region and talk about each airport. So at that level, they're really doing a fine job at keeping track of what's going on. But at a worldwide level, the database that they have set up to track the root causes behind the vulnerabilities that they find, the deficiencies, and the record of the corrective actions that they've recommended, it's just the data's not being entered as it should. And so
Excuse me, is that from an operational standpoint, somebody's just not doing it?
that's right. Somebody's just not doing it. It's a relatively new requirement, and I think it just hasn't become routine practice. But it is important to make sure that TSA has the information at an enterprise level to understand the different root causes behind the problems, what they're putting in place at the airports to try to fix it so that they can get a sense of what works and what doesn't.
Thank you. Mr. Lyons, have you been made aware of this?
Yes, I have, sir. And let me reassure this subcommittee that TSA is taking immediate action whenever we identify a vulnerability. We do have the documentation about those vulnerabilities, and we do concur with the GAO's recommendations. We have been working quite closely to shore up those recommendations.
So it's not a matter of you not having the resources to do it. You just need to have well, I guess you have the will, but we just need to carry it forward.
As Ms. Grover points out, it is a relatively new requirement in our system. And independent of GAO's review of our program, we have been working at revisions to our system to create a new tool to track the life cycle of those vulnerabilities so that we can identify the root cause of that vulnerability and what mitigation efforts we can apply to address that vulnerability.
So have you formally submitted this, Ms. Grover, to TSA?
Yes, sir, and they have formally concurred with our recommendation and stated that they intend to take action.
Okay, thank you. I guess the other question talks about the pre-clearance model and whether or not, Mr. Owens, you have all of the resources to expand pre-clearance to other airports?
Yes, part of the requirement with the new pre-clearance model that we adapted after we went operational in Abu Dhabi is that the partner countries that sign on for pre-clearance do so under a cost recovery basis. So they bear much of the cost to establish the facility, to have our officers present, so the resources are coming from those other countries that want to have us there.
So are we now saying if you can pay for it, we'll pre-clear you, or are we doing it based on number of passengers, or?
It's based on risk, and the negotiations that we have place pre-clearance in places like Abu Dhabi where we believe there's a strategic importance to be there. So that is really was what driving that. Clearly, there's a facilitation benefit as well that the airlines very much appreciate. But whenever we have an opportunity to address that potential risk at a last point of departure airport before that individual gets put on a plane to come here, that's the model we need to embrace more of.
Right, but if I said, were the next two airports the highest employment airports in the world coming to the U.S., what would your answer be?
I'm sorry, the question,
In other words, the pre-clearance we're giving to the next two airports,
yes.
is this based on the ability of those countries or those airports to pay the cost, or is it based on the number of passengers who are coming through the airport en route to the U.S.?
It's a combination of both. I mean, they have to incur the cost to have our officers there, to have the facility there. The cost only makes sense when there's a large enough throughput to have that return on investment. So a very small airport would probably not embrace pre-clearance, but a larger airport where that return on investment is financially possible would be more likely to embrace pre-clearance. But again, our decision to go out is based on where we see a strategic value from a risk assessment standpoint.
When we first put this in place, one of the problems is, Mr. Chairman, we went to airports who could pay rather than airports with the largest volume of passengers coming to the U.S. So that kind of skewed the risk model. And I'm trying to see, are we getting back in saying if we have 5,000 people coming from this airport and 1,000 coming from another, why are we doing the 1,000 passenger airport rather than the 5,000?
Right. And you really have to look at all the different variables as to what is behind this. Pre-clearance started in the early 1950s and was primarily a facilitation program with the airports out of Canada. The Abu Dhabi model, which we adopted 3 years ago, was really the new standard for how we treat pre-clearance. Identify high-risk locations where we feel our presence adds value, work cooperatively with the host country to make sure all of our requirements are met, as we have seen in Abu Dhabi.
Mr. Chairman, I think it would be instructive for the committee if we got the list of pre-clearance airports tied to how many passengers from those airports are coming and how they rank in terms of airports that we work with. I think, you know, that's the politics of it, but one of the challenges we have is if we put reimbursement for participation above numbers of passengers from a particular area, some of us think we are creating a bigger problem because those who can pay get pre-clearance, and those who can't participate by paying and might have 2, 3 times more people coming. And I understand the risk, but I think that's something that, from a policy standpoint, we can look at, Mr.
Yeah,
Chair.
I think, Mr. Thompson, I think that's an excellent point. I asked Mr. Owen to endeavor to get those statistics to us within 10 days, and then I think we should meet and talk about it.
Okay.
Thank you.
I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson. The chair now recognizes Ms. Watson-Coleman for 5 minutes of questioning.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, I seek unanimous consent to submit testimony for the record from the National Treasury Employees Union for today's hearing.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Rover, thank you so much for your testimony. It actually, it actually is good news that it is your assessment, is GAO's assessment that TSA is moving forward and doing the kinds of things that you had recommended over the course of a time, and that the minor issue, not minor, but the issue that you're really concerned about now is that they establish what they're finding and what they're going to do to respond to their findings. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am. TSA has made significant improvements in this program over many years.
That's
and
great to hear, because, so then with TSA not getting beaten up so badly, I hope that you'll find that you'll have higher morale, and people will recognize that the job that you all are doing is appreciated by everybody at every level. And one of the concerns that we've always had with TSA is that perhaps the morale was impacted by lack of movement out of certain positions, the type of job that you get to do. And what I'm wondering is, do you all have an upward mobility program where you take people within your agency that you see have certain promise and give them training so that they can move up through the agency and do some of these other, what seem to be really pretty exciting jobs on the international level, on the regional levels, and things of that nature?
Yes, I think I'm a really good example of that over my 20-year career. We do have mid-level and senior-level development programs. I'd be more than happy to take that back, as I'm not in the HR department, but I'd be more than happy to take that back and give the committee some additional details about our programs within TSA.
Abu Dhabi was an airport that had pre-clearance, but it also at some point became an airport where you had the restrictions on the personal electronic devices. Is that not true? Tell me, how did that happen?
Well, the security directives that were issued in March 2017 by then Secretary Kelly were to counter a very specific threat. And later in June 2017, then Secretary Kelly was evaluating the threat and directed TSA to issue global security directives and emergency amendments. And it was after our TSA assessment and inspection teams were able to review those locations that they were able to meet those enhanced standards, and since the restrictions were removed.
The restrictions from all the airports was removed?
From the 10 locations
From the
that were
10
specified in the March directives, that's
Okay,
correct.
so there's no, this restriction doesn't exist anywhere in any of the airports now, or does it?
That is correct.
Okay. You all have been very active, and you've done a lot of, I guess, going back, monitoring, making sure that things that you think are agreed upon are being done, and ensuring that the security standards are being upheld. Is that placing any kind of is that sustainable in terms of the resources that you have? I know that you went to a couple of hundred airports. You're going to go again to recheck. Do you have the resources to sustain that kind of oversight and monitoring?
Yes, we do. We do have a risk methodology for visiting airports, and our inspection teams follow that risk methodology in the way that they go and visit these locations.
So you have the manpower resources, the ability to hire. You've got a sufficient staff?
Yes, we believe that we are adequately resourced to perform our duties.
Mr. Owens, a couple of months ago, there were these incidences that were found at the Newark airport involving hazing, actually assaulting of some of newer or low-level employees by supervisors. And as a result of that, I believe that 3 of your employees were actually arrested, and about 5 of them were put on suspension or administrative leave.
Right, once the initiation of the investigation, several officers were placed on administrative duties where their law enforcement authorities were suspended, and with the conclusion or the ongoing investigation by the Office of the Office of the Inspector General, we've now had 3 officers that have been arrested and indicted for those actions.
Are you all looking into seeing if there are any other airports that have similar situations?
Yes, we are, and I would just tell you that we are all appalled by the behavior of those employees, and we would have fully cooperated with the IG throughout the investigation. I personally made management changes in Newark to address what I felt had been allowed to continue unaddressed. So we have taken this very seriously throughout the agency.
So are you looking at other airports?
Yes, we are. We have not found any indication that there's been similar misconduct in any other airports of entry.
Thank you, Mr. Owens. Have you engaged in any kind of employee development, employee training to ensure that your supervisors know their responsibilities, their accountabilities, and what is improper behavior that will not be tolerated?
Yes, we have.
Okay, yeah. We talked about the expanding of the pre-clearance programs to 2 or 10 or whether other airports, and you said that there are 2 other airports that
Yes.
we've engaged in that.
We have 2
Can you tell us who they are?
Yes, we have 2 signed agreements to move forward. So one is in Punta Cana and one is in Stockholm, Sweden. So those agreements have been signed. We're basically just waiting for the host country to address the infrastructure issues and any of their legal authority matters that they need to address. Outside of those 2 signed agreements, we are in negotiations at various stages with another 10 countries for further expansion throughout the world.
So my last question at this moment, because I'm just a little bit over as well, okay. The most recent travel ban
Yes, ma'am.
that has been released by the administration, do you anticipate, first of all, we don't completely understand the criteria that was used, and I don't think either one of you has the capacity to respond to why these particular countries were under this ban and what this ban really means. But what do you see the sort of pressure it's going to place on your resources?
Well, I could speak to the expected impact at the ports of entry. We will not see what we saw with the first travel ban. This is a more measured approach. There is a time period before it becomes effective. Anyone who currently has a valid travel document from those 8 countries is still allowed to travel. This does not pertain to legal permanent residents. Many of the areas that were so problematic in the first travel ban are not within this. So while I can't speak to the formulation of the policy, I can speak to the impact it will have at the ports of entry, and this will be very smooth, and you will not see any problems like you saw back in January, late January.
What is the implementation date, the beginning? I know it's phasing in. What is it?
There's phasing in for some of the countries.
Effective.
It's immediate. For some, it goes through October 18th.
Okay.
So based on different countries and the different categories, there's a more phasing in.
Does this require a different training?
No, because in order to travel to the United States, you need a valid travel document. Anyone who has a valid travel document, it will be admissible outside of other concerns that have nothing to do with the travel ban, our normal performance of the duty. So if someone from those 8 countries has a valid travel document today, they'd still be allowed to travel. And as a result, the impact at our ports of entry will be very, very minimal.
The impression I got was that there would be people who may not be permitted to come into this country today or in the beginning of this travel ban, but that could change. So is someone training people on what that criteria would be, those changes would be?
Yes, again, within CBP, it's quite simple. They need a valid travel document, a visa. If they have the
So
visa.
you're at the end of it.
We're at the end of it.
that
State Department is
food
at the
chain,
front
yeah.
of it. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you. That's something I think we need to explore with DHS. Thank you, Mr. Owens, Mr. Lenz, and Mr. Grover, and thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Watson-Coleman. The chair now recognizes a gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Keating.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was concerned with a recent Boston Globe investigative report entitled Secrets in the Sky, and it went back to something we still haven't corrected. And it seems that there's gaps, serious gaps between our agencies. This deals with the FAA procedure of licensing pilots and other related activities. And, you know, in the course of that, the FAA came back and said they're not the police officers of the sky, leaving the job to groups like Transportation Security Administration, Homeland Security, and the FBI. And indeed, TSA monitors all the time. In fact, they reference this 28 million airmen, you know, with threat assessments that they've monitored in a course. However, that's only as good as the material you have to look at. There's a huge gap that exists here where people have got their pilot's license using dead people's names, where there's someone that was sentenced to life imprisonment and released on compassionate grounds because he had cancer with the Lockerbie bombing threats. And he still had some valid credentials in the air. So my question is this, that I think Congress has tried from the FAA standpoint to get them to move and correct some of these things, which doesn't seem to be really working. My concern is, can TSA or Homeland Security have more oversight? What would you suggest to close this gap, to give you more ability to look at the materials you get in from the FAA? Because this gap is a serious one and presents a real safety issue with all the other things we're doing. This persists, and it was one of the concerns dating back to the 9/11 Commission that hasn't been addressed. So what I'm asking you is, from Homeland Security, from TSA standpoint, and having GAO look at these kind of issues as well as the Inspector General, we have to somehow, we can't let this gap exist between the FAA and TSA. And so from your perspective, what changes could we make as a Congress to give you more ability to have oversight over the original material that you're dealing with? I mean, looking at the numbers, 43,000 pilots received their license and they didn't provide permanent address, according to an audit just a few years ago. 8,000 people found the Social Security numbers on file belonged to dead people. So you're only as good as the information you get to review. What could you recommend we do to give you more oversight authority to make sure that that material you're getting from the FAA is, you know, is valuable, is accurate, and doesn't present a security risk?
Yes, thank you. We do work quite well with the intelligence community on information that we receive, and while I am aware of the security threat assessment process that is being performed by the TSA, it is not my area of expertise. I'd be more than happy to take that question back to get additional information regarding the security threat assessments that we do perform of FAA certificate holders.
Yeah, my question was not with TSA's ability to do that. You're only able to do that well, given the information that you have to review. So anything you could suggest as a follow-up to this hearing where we could look at changes, where TSA has a greater ability to review that FAA procedures, because they're letting it's so decentralized. They'll let airports do it. It's a real black hole in our security system, and it's something I think TSA and Homeland should have more ability to have oversight over. So I'd appreciate that. That's a real concern of mine. It should be a concern of all of ours. It hasn't been corrected since the recommendations of the 9/11 Commission. It's still with reports just like this, which I'll share with the committee.
You're offering to enter it into record?
Yes.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. So I'll do that. I'll look forward to suggestions. I know it's difficult for some agencies to come forth with suggestions over the boundaries, but I honestly think, given the time period and the results we've seen, the FAA isn't just doing it, just isn't going to do this. So we have to, I think, particularly this committee, have to give TSA more authority and oversight to review this serious issue. So thank you very much. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Keating. Ms. Watson-Coleman?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would ask unanimous consent for Congresswoman Jackson Lee to be allowed to sit at the dais and to ask questions at today's hearing.
Without objection, so ordered. Ms. Watson-Coleman, you recognize for 5 minutes of questions. Ms. Jackson Lee, you recognize 5 minutes of questions.
First of all, let me thank you for the courtesy of the chairman and the ranking member, and also the courtesy of extending to me the opportunity to be with you this morning. Forgive me for being delayed at another meeting, but I thought this was very important for several reasons, and I have a number of questions. But my first question is, have you all made an assessment of the conditions as relates to security at the airport in Puerto Rico, San Juan in particular? I'm not sure whether we have discussed that already, but the conditions are of a level of humanitarian crisis. I understand there may be 1,000 people or more at the airport. Have you sent additional personnel? What is the level of security at that airport? And then can I ask you on just a side issue, we've had a briefing from a number of our members of Puerto Rican descent, and it is imperative that you convey back to Secretary Duke, Chief of Staff Kelly, that there is an humanitarian crisis and there is need for immediate action even today. I want to put on record there should be some kind of military czar. Obviously, you are civilians established, and as well, the C-130s can probably land on the airport delivering food and medicine, which is what their desperate need. So you might comment as to whether you'll convey that aspect of it, but the question would be, have you assessed, since we're talking about aviation security global, whether you've had an assessment or there's an assessment going on the conditions at the airport in Puerto Rico because of the vulnerabilities that are there. I'll let you answer that, and I'll let you answer that, and let me follow up with another question.
Yes, thank you. Puerto Rico does have a TSA Federal Security Director because it is what we consider a domestic airport. It falls outside of my remit. I'm not sure of the exact details of the current status. TSA has stood up its Critical Incident Management Group, which is monitoring the situation to provide any needed assistance from the TSA assets. So I'm sorry, I'd have to take that back and get some further information for you.
So would you be willing to take it back, as well as my addendum regarding the immediate crisis that needs to be responded to? Obviously, Homeland Security is the supervising agency, but can collaborate with the U.S. Department of Defense. Would you convey that back, please?
I would, yes.
Sir, from the CBP, the conditions there that you're working with?
Yes, we have officers on the ground that have been working for full employee accountability to make sure our employees have come through the storm. We have done an initial assessment on the federal inspection site at the San Juan Airport, the area that we work in as we process the international. There has been some damage there, but it is not as significant. Saw much greater damage in St. Thomas and St. Croix as a result of the earlier storm. So we do have officers on the ground that are working towards that mission, but for the larger point, we will take that back to the department, ma'am.
Great. I won't, Ms. Grover, unless you want to answer. I don't know whether you.
Nothing to add, thank you.
Thank you. Let me additionally thank the TSA and CBP for their service to the nation. I usually always start with that and the excellent work that you all are doing, and particularly to the Transportation Security Administration. It's important to convey, because I remember the very thorny start that you had because we were so unused to it. Please let the men and women there know, because they're the first encountering, how much I appreciate their service. So my last question has to do with the enhanced ban, which I think takes a lot of resources. I'm not sure how effective the ban is adding these additional nations. What are you crafting? Are you going in to get a different matrix dealing with these expanded numbers? Are you needing expanded resources? Will you be using additional intelligence? And the last point, do you feel that you're at a high level of accountability on aviation security throughout the nation's domestic airports?
If I may interject just for a moment, this was covered thoroughly, so if you could do it in a summary fashion, that'd be helpful. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. In terms of the new travel ban, CBP is involved with the implementation at the airport. So we were not involved with the formulation. I can't speak to that. But what I can speak to is that it'll be a very smooth implementation. Those that have valid travel documents will continue to be allowed for travel. There is a graduated rollout for certain countries as part of this. Really the emphasis becomes at time of application for a visa, and that falls within the State Department. But at the U.S. airports, it'll be very smooth implementation. If there's valid travel documents, they'll be allowed to come into the country. We will not see the issues that we saw back in late January.
Anything with TSA?
No, from the perspective of you asked about the ban. I defer to the Department of Homeland Security statement on the travel ban.
Anything, Ms. Grover?
No, ma'am.
Yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jackson-Lee. Before we conclude, I just want to ask a question of both Mr. Lyons and Ms. Grover for information that both Ms. Watson-Coleman and myself would like to have quickly. And that is, as the subcommittee continues its oversight and due diligence in assessing international aviation threats, especially at LPD airports, it is very helpful for us to see which specific airports are of concern. Now, we touched on some of those today. I understand the sensitivity of this information. That's why we didn't get into it in an open setting. That's why I'm requesting that TSA provide to the committee in writing a ranking of the 10 worst LPD airports in terms of security and the reasoning for the poor ranking. And I also asked Ms. Grover to provide information that she has regarding those airports that are not either not meeting ICAO standards or having troubles meeting ICAO standards, and provide as much detail as you can on those. And I ask that both of you produce that information to us within 5 business days. Is that doable?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Lyons?
Yes, Congressman, I do believe that we have provided some of those details from the FAA Extension Safety and Security Act of 2016. Our agency was required to produce a report. If you have not already received that, I'll make sure that you get that.
Right, but it's not just a report. We were specifically asked about the 10 worst LPD airports in terms of security and the reasoning for the poor ranking, as well as those that are struggling to meet the ICAO standards. All right?
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank all the witnesses for their testimony today. It's extremely helpful, as always. We're all on the same page here. That's one thing I love about this subcommittee and this Homeland Security as a whole. It's about as bipartisan as you can get, because keeping this country safe is about a bipartisan issue as you can have, and that's why it's very rewarding to work on this committee. Members of the committee may have some additional questions for witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing pursuant to Committee Rule 7D. The hearing record will be open for 10 days. Without objection, the subcommittee stands adjourned.